Most father and son stories in The Sopranos are loud. They come with screaming at dinner tables, years of bitterness, hidden jealousy, old wounds that never close, and some ugly fight over love, money, or respect. Carmine Sr. and Little Carmine are different. Their story is quieter than that, and because it is quieter, people often underestimate how interesting it really is. There is no giant emotional explosion that defines them. There is no one scene where the whole truth spills out and the audience is told exactly what each man is. Instead, what makes them fascinating is the gap between appearance and reality. One looks like the perfect mob boss, the kind of man who seems built in a factory to run a New York crime family. The other looks like a joke, a soft and confused rich kid who never fully learned how to speak, never fully understood how dangerous his own position was, and never seemed serious enough to be taken as a real contender. But once you stay with them longer, the easy reading starts to crack. Carmine Sr. is not just a polished old Don, and Little Carmine is not just comic relief. They are two very different kinds of men, and the distance between them tells us a lot about power, intelligence, ego, survival, and what the mafia rewards in one generation versus what it destroys in the next. Carmine Sr. represents a kind of old-world competence that almost feels extinct by the time the show is in full motion. He is not flashy, he is not theatrical, he does not need to prove that he is the smartest man in the room because everyone around him already behaves as if that is true. His power feels settled. It has weight. He speaks like a man who knows that other people will spend all day interpreting his words, so he can afford to say less. That is one of his greatest strengths. In a world where weakness gets punished and loose talk causes wars, Carmine Sr. understands the value of being hard to read. He almost never gives people the full thing. He gives them part of it, enough to steer them, enough to test them, enough to protect himself. That is not just caution. That is discipline. A lot of men in this world think leadership means domination in the moment. Carmine Sr. understands that real leadership often means controlling what happens 3 moves later. That patience is one of the biggest differences between him and Little Carmine. Carmine Sr. is built for delayed results. He thinks in terms of structure, precedent, percentages, stability. He does not need emotional satisfaction right away. He can let an insult hang. He can let a grudge simmer. He can let somebody else do the shouting while he studies the board. That makes him dangerous in a way many of the more emotional men in the series are not. Tony can be dangerous because he is explosive. Johnny Sack can be dangerous because he is proud and relentless. Phil can be dangerous because he is bitter and rigid. Carmine Sr. is dangerous because he does not need his ego fed every second. He can wait. That ability to wait is one of the purest forms of strength in the mafia, because so much bloodshed comes from men who cannot tolerate a bruise to the ego. He also has one quality that separates true bosses from glorified captains, and that is an understanding that the job is not to feel powerful, it is to keep the machine profitable. Carmine Sr. is not romantic about the life. He does not seem to view leadership as a stage for personal drama. He views it more like management at the highest criminal level. That may sound cold, but in his world it is a major advantage. He knows that every personal conflict threatens revenue. Every war creates uncertainty. Every emotional overreaction can attract attention and cost money. He may tolerate violence, authorize violence, and benefit from violence, but he does not seem addicted to it emotionally. For him, it is part of the system, not the meaning of the system. That makes him more mature than most of the men around him. It also explains why he often seems above the noise. Men like Johnny Sack and Tony are constantly pulled into the emotional theater of the job. They are always reacting to pride, slights, insecurity, fear of disrespect, rumors, pressure from their own guys. Carmine Sr. looks less vulnerable to that. Not immune, but less vulnerable. He knows what his position is, and because of that, he does not spend his energy proving it. There is something almost corporate about him. That is why he can appear calm even when others are spiraling. He understands that a boss who gets dragged into every emotional storm stops being a boss and starts becoming just another loud man in the suit. But that same strength also contains one of his weaknesses. Carmine Sr. is so controlled, so insulated, and so used to operating above the emotional level of other men that he can come off detached in a dangerous way. He sometimes feels like a man who has mastered the system so completely that he forgets how much unstable emotion still powers it underneath. A mafia family is not a clean institution. It is full of insecure men with guns, money, grudges, and constant anxiety about status. A boss cannot fully escape that emotional reality. He can rise above it for a while, but he still depends on managing people who do not think like him. Carmine Esor's distance can make him stronger, but it can also make him slower to grasp how personally others are taking things. That is why men like Johnny Sack can become so combustible under him. Carmine Sr. may believe he is being practical, but men under him may experience that practicality as disrespect, coldness, or indifference. That gap matters because Johnny Sack is one of the clearest examples of what Carmine Sr. does not fully control. Johnny is ambitious, proud, deeply sensitive to insult, and intensely aware of rank. He wants clarity, appreciation, and proper recognition. Carmine Sr. does not operate by feeding those needs. He operates by keeping everyone useful and slightly off balance. That works for a long time, but it also creates resentment. One of the weaknesses of old, confident power is that it sometimes forgets how much maintenance people require. Carmine Sr. can read situations well, but reading a situation is not the same as nurturing loyalty inside it. His style produces order, but not always affection. That is an important point when comparing him to Little Carmine, because for all of Little Carmine's obvious flaws, he has a strange capacity for warmth that his father lacks. He is more social in a loose, less intimidating way. He does not produce fear like Carmine Sr., and he certainly does not produce the same respect, but he can make people feel more at ease. That sounds small, but it is not. In a world full of sharks, a man who lowers the emotional temperature has value. The problem is that Little Carmine lowers it partly because he is not taken as seriously. His softness is both his gift and his handicap. Little Carmine's biggest weakness is the easiest to see. He lacks authority of presence. When he enters a room, he does not bend it around himself the way his father does. He talks too much, and worse, he talks in a way that makes people focus on his phrasing instead of his meaning. He reaches for grand language and often lands somewhere clumsy and half-formed. That makes him look foolish, and in the mafia, looking foolish is almost as dangerous as being foolish. Perception is power in that world. The minute men decide you are not serious, every statement you make becomes optional. That is a terrible condition for a would-be leader. And yet, it would be too easy and too shallow to say that Little Carmine is simply dumb. He is not a strong speaker, but there is a difference between verbal awkwardness and actual stupidity. In fact, one of the show's quiet tricks is that it lets the audience laugh at Little Carmine for his language, while gradually revealing that he often understands life more clearly than the supposedly sharper men around him. He is not good at performing intelligence in the mob style. He does not cut people to pieces with precision like Johnny Sack. He does not issue smooth, loaded statements like his father. He does not dominate conversation. But there are moments when he shows a kind of wisdom that the harder men never reach. It is less tactical and more human. This is where the difference between the two men becomes really interesting. Carmine Sr. is better at power. Little Carmine is better at self-knowledge. Carmine Sr. understands systems, hierarchy, leverage, and the management of dangerous men. Little Carmine, by the end, understands something much rarer in this universe, which is the limit of what power can actually do for a person. That does not make him the stronger mobster. It makes him, in a very specific and almost ironic sense, the healthier man. When Little Carmine gets drawn into succession politics after his father's death, he enters a game that exposes all his weak points at once. He does not have the natural command to rally hardened men to fear or certainty. He does not have the sharpness to dominate high-stakes negotiation. He does not have the killer instinct of men like Johnny Sack or Phil. He also does not seem to fully grasp how much symbolic authority matters in that environment. Being the boss's son gives him a claim, but not enough substance behind the claim. He has the bloodline without the force of personality. In many criminal or royal systems, that combination is explosive. It creates entitlement without capacity, ambition without a stable base, status without control. That is exactly the kind of mix that starts wars. His weakness here is not just that he is softer than his father. It is that he is less precise about what he wants and less capable of imposing a disciplined path toward it. Carmine Sr. wanted a functioning empire. Little Carmine sometimes seems to want the title, the aura, the continuation of family prestige, but not all the brutal work that truly secures it. And in a world like this, partial desire is dangerous. If a man wants power badly enough, he can become ruthless. If he does not want it badly enough, he should stay out of the race. The worst position is somewhere in the middle, where a man is willing to contest the throne just enough to create casualties, but not enough to win cleanly. That is where Little Carmine briefly lives, and it exposes that he is not built like his father. At the same time, that failure is also part of what makes him more admirable as a man. Carmine Sr. would probably see stepping back as weakness. Men like Johnny and Phil certainly would. In the mob view of masculinity, giving up the crown looks like surrender. But the show slowly suggests that Little Carmine's retreat from the top may be one of the smartest, most mature decisions anyone makes. He begins to understand that becoming boss would not complete him. It would consume him. It would turn his life into endless tension, endless tests, endless insecurity, endless blood. He sees what the role does to men. He sees how it hollows them out. And unlike Tony, Johnny, or Phil, he is capable of asking whether the prize is even worth having. That is where his strongest point lives. Little Carmine has a capacity for detachment from ego that almost no one in this world possesses. Not perfect detachment, because he does get involved and he does enjoy status, but enough detachment to stop before it destroys him. That is extraordinary in The Sopranos. Most men in this universe would rather die than feel that they back down. Their pride is stronger than their survival instinct. Their image is stronger than their judgment. Little Carmine, for all his vanity and silliness, ends up doing something profoundly unmob-like. He chooses a smaller life on purpose. He chooses a life that might look less impressive to others, but is actually safer, calmer, and more human. That is not how a classic mob son is supposed to behave, but it may be why he lasts. Carmine Sr., on the other hand, is a man who seems fully fused with the role he occupies. He is the boss in a way that does not even feel like acting. There is no visible daylight between the man and the position. That is partly why he is so effective. He does not seem to suffer from the kind of inner conflict that destroys other characters. He has reconciled himself to the logic of his world. He knows what he is, what his priorities are, and what his responsibilities demand. There is power in that coherence. A lot of men in The Sopranos are split down the middle. Tony is split between appetite and guilt, family life and criminal life, brutality and self-pity, authority and insecurity. Chris is split between ambition and self-destruction, loyalty and resentment, fantasy and reality. Carmine Sr. feels more unified. He may not be morally admirable, but he is psychologically less chaotic. Still, that unity may also reveal a spiritual emptiness. He is effective because he has accepted the terms of the game completely. But what does that say about him as a man? It says he is not confused, but it also says he may be limited. He knows the value of money, order, influence, and restraint, but there is little sign that he is reaching for anything beyond that. He is stable, but maybe because he has narrowed himself into a shape that fits the machine perfectly. Little Carmine, by contrast, is more ridiculous but also more open. He is less elegant as a gangster, but more capable of drifting towards some version of peace. The father is the superior boss. The son may be the superior human being. This contrast also shows up in how each man handles language. Carmine Sr. uses language like a weapon wrapped in silk. He is measured. He can insult without sounding emotional. He can pressure people without appearing to raise his voice. He understands that language in a hierarchy is not just communication, it is positioning. Every phrase has to preserve status, deny vulnerability, and leave room to move later. That is why he feels so seasoned. He rarely wastes words, and he rarely says something that traps him. This is one of his major strong points, especially in a world where one sentence can start a feud or expose weakness. Little Carmine, on the other hand, uses language in a way that almost undermines him at every turn. He wants to sound elevated, but his reach exceeds his grasp. That creates accidental comedy, but it also makes people dismiss him before they really listen. Yet, there is something revealing in that too. Carmine Sr. uses language to control perception. Little Carmine uses language to reach upward toward a version of himself he wants to be. The father is secure enough not to decorate himself verbally. The son decorates because he is insecure, because he wants recognition, because he wants to be seen as substantial. That insecurity is a weakness, but it is also strangely innocent compared with the uglier forms of insecurity we see elsewhere. Little Carmine embarrasses himself. Other men get people buried. Another major difference between them is how each relates to violence. Carmine Sr. clearly accepts violence as a tool of business and power, but he seems far from it emotionally. He is not excited by it. He does not seem to need to perform his hardness constantly. That is a mark of confidence. Truly powerful men in this world often outsource the drama of violence. They do not need to snarl and bark every minute because they know the machinery is there when they need it. Carmine Sr.'s relationship to violence is cold and managerial. That makes him more frightening in a sophisticated way because it means he can authorize harm without getting lost in passion. Little Carmine seems much less naturally aligned with violence. He comes from the same world and benefits from its system, but there is a sense that he does not wear violence comfortably as identity. He can participate in a violent structure, but he does not radiate the inner hardness that men like his father, Johnny, or Phil do. In a different life, he might have just been a mediocre rich man living off family connections, harmless and a bit pompous. In the mafia, that softness becomes a liability. But from a moral or human point of view, it may be the best thing about him. He is not eager for the ugliest side of the role. This becomes especially important when thinking about father and son not just as individuals, but as symbols of generational change. Carmine Sr. belongs to an era where the mafia still seems to have a clearer internal grammar. It is still vicious, still corrupt, still brutal, but it has recognizable lines of authority and codes of conduct that powerful men can use to maintain order. Little Carmine belongs to a later phase, where the inherited form remains, but the inner substance is weaker. He has the title of prince without the education of a real king. He inherits prestige, but not the full architecture of control that made his father effective. That is not only his personal failure, it is also part of the broader decay the show keeps returning to. Sons inherit the shell, not the steel, but again, the show refuses to make that simple. Because while little Carmine is weaker in the traditional mafia sense, he also escapes some of the spiritual trap that swallowed the older men. He is not made of the same iron, and because of that he cannot dominate the criminal world the way his father did. Yet that same softness may be what allows him to survive without becoming as poisoned. The old world praises men like Carmine Sr. because they keep the organization strong. The show, however, is always asking a darker question, which is strong for whom and at what cost? Carmine Sr. may be the more competent Don, but competence in this universe often means being highly evolved in a rotten system. Little Carmine's weakness as a Don may be inseparable from his relative success as a person who still has a chance to enjoy life. There is also something important in how each man handles identity. Carmine Sr. seems completely certain of who he is. He does not need to search. He does not seem to waver. That certainty is useful, but it can also make a man rigid. If you fully identify with being the boss, then losing power becomes unthinkable. Every threat to the throne becomes a threat to self. Little Carmine, by contrast, is more fluid. Sometimes that looks like aimlessness. Sometimes it looks like foolishness. But it also means he is less trapped by a single image. He can imagine a life where he is not at the center of the New York family. Most mob men cannot imagine that without feeling annihilated. Little Carmine can. That ability to step outside the role is maybe the clearest dividing line between them. Carmine Sr. would likely regard that as weakness because his whole life is built on inhabiting the role without apology. But the series keeps showing that men who cannot step outside their role are doomed to be devoured by it. Tony cannot stop being Tony Soprano, even in his own house. Johnny cannot stop being Johnny Sack, even when his pride is wrecking practical solutions. Phil cannot stop being Phil, even when revenge is costing him the future. Little Carmine, in his own clumsy way, does something these supposedly tougher men cannot do. He accepts that there is no shame in not being king if being king means living in permanent war. That does not mean he is some pure figure. He is still vain. He still likes the status of his name. He still gets pulled into contests that he should have avoided. He is still a product of nepotism and privilege. His comfort is built on a murderous system. The show never lets him become morally clean. But moral cleanliness is not the point here. The point is that among deeply flawed men, he has a rare spark of perspective. He can see that a title is not the same thing as fulfillment. That is more wisdom than many stronger men ever reach. Carmine SR's strongest points, then, are obvious but worth stating clearly. He is disciplined, patient, politically intelligent, emotionally controlled, and focused on stability over vanity. He understands hierarchy and knows how to preserve it. He uses speech carefully, rarely exposes himself, and sees the criminal empire as a structure to maintain rather than a theater for personal melodrama. He is formidable because he does not need constant performance. His weaknesses are subtler. He can be cold, overly detached, and insufficiently attentive to the emotional needs and resentments festering under him. He is so good at being a boss that he may be less developed as anything else. He commands the system but seems deeply contained by it too. Little Carmine's strong points are harder to spot but maybe more surprising. He has a softer ego than the truly doomed men. He is capable of stepping back. He has enough self-awareness, eventually, to recognize what kind of life he actually wants. He can be personable, less suffocating, less driven by pure fury. He has a kind of accidental wisdom, the wisdom of a man who stumbles into truth instead of conquering his way to it. His weaknesses are also clear. He lacks presence, clarity, rhetorical precision, tactical force, and the deep authority required to rule violent men. He can drift into serious situations without the seriousness needed to control them. He often looks like a man playing dress-up in a suit tailored by his father's legacy. And maybe that is the deepest difference between them. Carmine Sr. wears power naturally. Little Carmine wears inheritance awkwardly. The father built himself into the shape of a ruler. The son inherited the shadow of one. The father knows how to command a world. The son slowly learns how to avoid being ruined by it. One man masters the mafia. The other man, in his own strange and imperfect way, masters the urge to let the mafia define his whole soul. That is why their story is so much richer than the usual reading. It is not just about a strong father and a weak son. It is about two different forms of intelligence. Carmine Sr. has strategic intelligence, social control, cold patience, and institutional instinct. Little Carmine has emotional distance from the crown, a late-blooming understanding of limits, and a rare ability to choose peace over image. In the immediate mob sense, the father is greater by a mile. In the broader sense of who ends up closer to a livable life, the son makes a compelling case for himself. The tragedy, if there is one, is that the world they come from only fully respects one of those men. It respects the man who can command fear, preserve order, and keep the money flowing. It does not respect the man who says enough. I do not need the whole kingdom. In the mafia imagination, that sounds like weakness. But The Sopranos is too smart to leave it there. The show keeps exposing how so-called strength turns into self-destruction when it is built on ego, paranoia, and the inability to let go. Carmine Sr. survives long enough to look like the model. Little Carmine survives long enough to suggest a different model altogether, one that nobody in that world would openly praise, but one that may actually be wiser. So when we compare them as men, not just as gangsters, the answer becomes more layered than people expect. Carmine Sr. is stronger in command, sharper in judgment, more impressive in authority, and far more suited to ruling a dangerous organization. He is the kind of man history inside that world remembers with respect because he knew how to hold the center. Little Carmine is weaker in every traditional measure of mob masculinity. He is less commanding, less feared, less coherent as a leader, and much easier to underestimate. But he also possesses something his father either never had or never valued enough, and that is the ability to realize that winning the game is not always the same thing as living well. In a series full of men who would burn their lives down rather than lose face, that makes little Carmine look almost ridiculous at first, and then unexpectedly profound. That is the final irony of the two Carmines. The father looks like the complete man because he perfectly fits the role his world rewards. The son looks incomplete because he does not. But by the end, the question becomes whether fitting that role perfectly is actually a sign of greatness, or a sign of how deeply a man has been claimed by a rotten system. Carmine Sr. is the better Don, the better strategist, the better political animal. Little Carmine is the better example of a man who, despite vanity and weakness and foolishness, still manages to leave some space between himself and the machine. And in The Sopranos, that little bit of space can be the difference between dying for your image and surviving long enough to become something slightly more human.